A day in the life of a commoner in London in 1595.
Hey Alexane, what's a commoner?
Commoners are ordinary people living in community and nation. They are not members of any royalty, which means they have no rank or title given. Commoners were also called common men or common people living in a village or city. Most commoners were reported and divided in three categories, which called the helpless poor, which are disabled children, old and sick people. Second, we have the able-bodied poor, which are people who could work and wanted to work. Lastly, we have the rogue and vagabonds. They were well seen as by the government because they could work but stole and begged instead. As you can see in the pictures, there's a couple of people, an example of a family, a man and woman, and a village with commoners.
What were jobs options for women and men?
Working commoners did the same thing every day. It was very repetitive. Women were seen inferior to men and had always to obey them. Women would usually do housework the majority of the time. Sometimes they would go work in the garden or with animals, if their husband would let them or needed help. Also, women had received no education to where they were prepared to work in the house only and expected to marry to depend on the man. Men then would work on the farms and in the field. They did a lot of farm-related jobs with animals, and they did other jobs like landowners, trade workers, blacksmiths, builders, and servants. They would get paid to work but very little amount of money. Also, all the money would go to pay for the taxes and support the family. They would then struggle to pay for essential things. What did commoners eat?
Commoners would usually eat fried chicken, ham, fried fish or fish, meatloaf, or even pork chops. Vegetable would be served too, just like beans, mashed potatoes, sweet potatoes, corn, or any vegetable they would get depending on the season. Salt pork was fried and used a lot as a spice. Depending how much money they had to eat, it would depend on that too. In the winter, they would usually eat cheese with eggs, and if they could get meat, they would eat it too. When they could, they would eat fat bacon and salted pork would be added. And if they would look for meat, they would chase for either sheep or pigeons. Stew was a traditional meat for commoners. In the pictures here, you can see how they would prepare their food or meat. And on the right top side, you can see the pot that they were making stew in it. And people found it a couple of years ago, and it's from 1595.
What did commoners wear?
Women, like housewives, would usually wear dresses. Most of the time, their dresses had long sleeves, a long neckline. Some dresses had print on them, and some didn't. If they didn't have that much money, the dresses would be different. The colors were really dark, like brown or gray. They were really simple but comfortable. The dresses would be made of wool. Men would usually wear working clothing so they wouldn't be in trouble if they dirtied their clothes in the fields while working. Commoners would usually be poor, so they would wear their clothes more than once and made by themselves. They would also wear stockings and leather shoes. Here's some example of what commoners used to wear. You can see on the bottom their shoes they would wear.
What would they do for amusement? Commoners had not much time to do anything other than work during most part of the day. When their work was finished, they would go to something that was cheap. Plays were a big part of London at the time and still are to this day. For commoners, it was not an everyday thing. They would not go that often since it cost money. They also had books for women and kids would read when they had some times after work. There was also a thing called animal biting, where animals would try to kill each other, like horses against dogs and bulls against dogs. There was also lottery. People were bidding to win some amount of money. This was not an often played thing by commoners since they had to put some money to win some. And if they lost some money, they could not be able to support their families and pay taxes. There was a lot of music. Most men were expected to be able to play some instruments, such as violins, lutes, and even singing. Lastly, there was sports, like archery, which men had to be between 7 and 60 to shoot and be able to use arrows and bows. In the summer, wrestling and football was very popular among young men. Here you can see in the image, you have some kids and women and men dancing to some music. And there you have an example of what was animal biting, and you have an example of plays.
What would kids used to do back then?
Children of commoners had different lives depending on their gender. Boys that had parents with a little more money were sent to school to learn about artwork, religion, and language, etc. If their parents could not afford education, yes, you needed to pay for school. Then they would go to work to help their families and support them. Girls, on the other hand, had no education delivered to them. They needed to stay at home and learn about the housework with their moms. What's a couple of fun facts about commoners?
The life expectancy was about 45 years old, and most commoners did home remedies to treat hurt families members. They rarely called doctors because it cost a large amount of money. They were often called the Lord's villains because they were poor and seen as slaves by richer people. Thanks for listening!